Today on the Sorch podcast, I have the pleasure to talk to Amal Malik, who has recently graduated from the University of Warwick with the BA in History. Amal's dissertation focused on storytelling as protest. How did South Asian women forge solidarity and create spaces for the community in Britain? Again, this is going to be the topic of our conversation today. By your own admission, the dissertation considered how South Asian women created sites of safety that enabled them to share their experiences of marginality. The interpersonal nature of the experiences in the dissertation is a celebration of a community faced by widespread racism, misogyny, homophobia, and isolation orchestrated by the state, covering 30-odd years from the 1970s to the early 2000s. So, before we get started, just a quick reminder to any of those listening on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button because it really helps us more than you can imagine. With that out of the way, I have to obviously say thank you so much for making the time to have this conversation with me. And before we dive into getting to know your family background and more about you, I always like to start with, how are you and how is everything going?
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm doing okay, actually. Very tired, very long Eid yesterday with my family, so it ended quite late. But I'm doing all right. The weather is killing me a little bit, but we're good.
Oh, the weather is so hot. I'm absolutely melting, but I'm waiting for it to rain. Hopefully it should rain soon.
I know, it's actually quite grim, but it's fine. We move.
Typical British attitudes to weather. When it's too hot, we complain. When it's too cold, we complain. So
it was just, I think also in London right now, everything is so tight packed in concrete, and where I live as well. Yeah, it's not a great mix. Not. And also, there was loads of people around my area, obviously, because of Eid. So everyone was just, I think, a little bit frustrated and flustered by it. But yeah, it's still been quite nice, I think, because I think all of us have appreciated a bit of sun in comparison to the last few weeks of really crap weather.
Yeah, no, definitely. I can imagine it is a lot of fun, especially with all the family and everyone getting together.
Mm-hmm.
Just explain a little bit then about your family background, where you guys come from, and how you ended up where you are today, because this is a question I would ask everyone on the podcast, simply because the stories that come out of it are stranger than like fiction. Like, they're just so interesting. So yeah, staying with that, like.
Yeah, so my parents, well, my dad moved to the UK when he was around like 17 or 18, when my granddad moved to the UK just for work, and he's from Lahore, and they're like kind of outskirty little village parts of Lahore, which I went to quite a lot when I was younger. It was really nice. Love Lahore. And my dad currently is a food sauce owner called Bellos, who produces his own line of like sauces for like chicken and marinades and stuff like that. But that's also been like a really long progress of like, he initially started a fashion business when he first moved to the UK called Bellos, and he lost the label of Bellos because he sold it because things went tits up. And then like so many years later, he's come back to naming his brand Bellos, and that's his journey in a nutshell for moving. And he married my mum when she was around 27, which for her community in Pakistan was quite new, because my mum had done a undergrad in Urdu literature and her master's in history, which obviously kind of fed into like my interest in history. It was a really important part of us growing up, and my mum teaching us a lot about Islamic history and kind of knowing and recognizing an Islamic representation within like what we currently know, I suppose. So yeah, that is my parents. My mum's from Islamabad though, so she's from like a different city. Very different vibes in both areas. But yeah, and then I have two older brothers, and a sister-in-law and a nephew who has recently turned 1.
Oh, that's so sweet. Oh, bless. That's amazing. There's so much in there that I just want to dive into. So, talking about your mum just for a quick second, then, did she do her undergrad and her master's in Islamabad then?
She did it in Punjab University.
Oh wow! Okay.
Yeah. And she tells me a lot about how initially she moved into the dorm. My mom has like a phobia of lizards, and which she could like, she has a phobia of chickadees. She would always say. So she'd always get really paranoid about moving out. So she moved into like an auntie's who lived near the university, and then did her 4 years of education. But she's a very good poet. She still occasionally writes poetry. And she wrote a very impressive dissertation from what I've heard from all of her family, which I would love to read one day, but I don't think she has anymore. So she's been a major source of inspiration because I think her dissertation was literally all focused on Urdu poetry and its impact in Pakistan, something like that. But yeah, she's quite an enigma. She doesn't really, I feel like with a lot of Asian parents, like they have so many secrets, they just pop up randomly as you get older, which is very much her in a nutshell. So yeah, she's a very hardworking woman. And when she moved to the UK, unfortunately, she wasn't able to pursue education just because she became one of the main carers for my gran and for raising all of us, me and my 3 siblings, while my dad was working. But she did a lot with trying to implement things that she learned with her degree actually teaching us, which was really lovely and something I think I've grown to appreciate a lot more as I've gotten older, which is probably the main reason why I think history. So she's been quite a big impact on a lot of my interests, actually.
Yeah, I think those listening can tell because the energy that comes with your words when you're discussing about your mom, especially, you can feel it, you can almost touch it. And it's amazing. And it's obviously had a huge and positive influence on you because you've gone and done a history degree, and I've had the pleasure to read your dissertation. I think it's absolutely brilliant. Just a quick question then, what led to your parents moving over to the UK then? What made them make that decision? Because a lot of the time, so for argument's sake, in my case, my grandma, my dad's side, they were forced out of Kenya because of what was going on in Uganda with Idi Amin and all of the kind of backlash of that. But in your case, was it just kind of a financial decision, or was it just kind of, I don't know, what led to that?
It was largely financial, actually. So again, family secrets, they're really bad at kind of telling us initially why they moved. But from what I know, my dada was working on the railway in Maldives on behalf of the British. And I think he wanted to move and settle in the UK just because he had so many children. So my dad is the oldest of the sons, and he has an older sister. But I suppose with a lot of Asian families, if you are the oldest son, even if there is an older sister, you're still going to take charge. So it was very much when my granddad moved to the UK, and he was working, he got quite ill. And my dad took a lot of those responsibilities on himself, which is why he led a lot of the whole, I'm going to establish my own business because I want to kind of create a new footing for my family when he first moved. And he has a very interesting life because he got to do a lot of traveling with his kind of business, because I suppose being in fashion, talks about going to the Milan Fashion Week when it used to happen, really exciting trips that he used to do as a result of it. So he's a very cultured man. But yeah, I think it's quite hard when I think we talk about why exactly, because largely it was financial. And I suppose education wasn't exactly the main priority in that as well, though, because it was mainly about let's just focus on cultivating a good livelihood, well, for my dad especially, for the rest of his siblings, and helping them kind of establish their lives in the UK. And we're very lucky, all my family lives around the same area in Ilford. All of us are doing relatively well, whatever we've done, we've done apprenticeships, university. That is very much due to essentially my granddad first moving over to the UK. And then, that's just the kind of trail that we've all taken.
Yeah, fair. Yeah, I was, it was my grandma's birthday, I think last week or the week before. And so we gone over and we just got talking, and I asked her, I was considering you're 80, I think she turned 84 or something. Yeah, 84. I was what is your first, what's your first memory that you can remember as a child? And she was oh, I remember, she was saying she could remember her mother at about the age of 5-ish. And I've always heard about her mother, so my great grandma, but I've never seen a photo. And so my grandma was oh, so-and-so sent us a photo of her. And I shared that photo yesterday. I was actually thinking, I was had these people just made one slight different decision, everything would be so different. And then we were obviously talking about that and kind of, I guess, reminiscing with her about how things were. But just something that's come to me off the back of everything we've been discussing, and also because a lot of the time the news portrays Pakistan in a very polarized fashion. Like, what are your views or your family's views of Pakistan as a place?
No, it's fine. I'm going to be honest, I have quite different views in Pakistan to my parents. My parents are planning eventually to move to Pakistan because especially my mum has all her family in Pakistan. Like, she doesn't really have as much family in the UK at all. Like, my dad has all of his siblings, but my mum's are like all in either Pakistan or America, but largely they're all in Pakistan. So ultimately, I think just to be closer to her family, and especially because my brother, our oldest brother who has a nephew, lives in Dubai, they want to be a bit more closer with that kind of thing. And my brother does want to as well. My other brother wants me to Pakistan as well. Whereas I think I'm quite different. Just in the news recently it's really hard because there's been so many recent attacks on women in Pakistan that I, as a woman who's Pakistani, would not feel comfortable living there. Like, the increase in femicide, like, there is a massive attack on minorities, on Christian minorities in Pakistan, on our Ahmadis. It isn't somewhere I think actually I would feel comfortable living in, particularly right now as an unmarried young girl who is still studying. Like, I don't feel particularly comfortable. But in saying that, I don't think that's always a majority of people's experiences. But I think if you come from quite a privileged background in Pakistan, you have the opportunity to thrive and have that kind of protection, that security. But if you are more on the margins, I think like most places as well, you are very vulnerable to those kind of attacks on your identity. That's the thing. So I find it really hard. Obviously, like, I've loved it every time I've gone back to Pakistan, but that isn't a very privileged, small experience of maybe like a month max. Versus I've not grown up there, like, I've not lived there. My experiences with staying there with like family as like a holiday would not be the same as like a young woman who's actually had to live and grow up in Pakistan. So I also don't want to speak over like a generic experience of what it is to be a young Pakistani girl.
No, fair. No. I appreciate that. That's also why I thought you'd be the perfect person to ask that question to, because I do think that, and I think this is something that's just become far more popular with social media, is everything's kind of turned into this generalized or turned into this monolithic kind of view. And so, yeah, I appreciate the fact that we can't actually talk over anyone else's kind of lived experience because, to be honest, as you said, like, we don't live there. But I guess for me, you're closer to the reality than I am, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that completely. Like, I think the thing is, like, this is just based on like me going small periods of time and me still, there's always little things that I felt really uncomfortable about. But also I think following like popular social media activists in Pakistan, like Instagram accounts like Womanistan, who's really fantastic in trying to keep up to date with kind of current events from the perspective of things that actually affect women in Pakistan. Because I feel like there's been a lot of polarizing opinions and stuff like the Azadi March for Women, really negative one, actually. So I think trying to actually get in contact and see women who are on the ground doing those kind of grassroots work in Pakistan is actually much more important. Which is, it's been, I think, especially over the last few weeks, I think if people do want to know more, follow accounts like Womanistan, because they are really helpful actually trying to get, I think, a more nuanced perspective of what actually it means to be like better and to be marginalised in Pakistan much better, I think, and probably I'd be able to phrase it a lot better than I am. No,
not a problem. That's absolutely fair. I appreciate the honesty and the answer, because like that's the entire point of this conversation.
Yeah.
All right, well, just moving the focus then, still obviously remaining on women because that is the topic of your dissertation, but coming back into the UK. Now, in your acknowledgements, you include the women of the Sari Squad. I hope I'm pronouncing this one correct. The Jagonari Centre, Bradford Women's Centre and Club Gali. I know we're going obviously to find out more about this, and we're going to discuss these places in a lot more detail kind of in a minute, but why are they so important that you needed to include them in your acknowledgements?
I think I talk about this in my dissertation as well. I think there is a tendency for historical practice to kind of exploit people's stories for a narrative or for just presenting your work in a certain, dialogue. But I think my point of using oral history was to kind of, which kind of comes up in the dissertation, is to kind of stay true to a lot of these organizations who speak for themselves. Like, I don't need to speak over them. I don't need to speak on behalf of them. I can just record and present what I'm inferring from it. But ultimately, I think the reason why I acknowledge it is because I want people themselves to go out to look and research at these organizations and to inform their own opinions, because they have done fantastic work. They have done incredible grassroots organizing, especially ones that are still active right now, like Club Kali is fantastic. Jagonari Centre, unfortunately, I think shut down recently. It was inactive. Sari Squad, I think that's kind of with the end of like kind of second wave feminism and stuff like that, which is also really complicated and comes up in the dissertation. Like, these organizations whose historical and present work has informed so much of South Asian women's history in Britain. And for my own dissertation, for me to not acknowledge that, I think would be a disservice to the fact that if I'm writing about them, then I should be highlighting them.
Yeah, no, touche. I can't pick any bones with that, really. So yeah, no, fair enough. You mentioned again that memorializing a living history that impacted generations to come is how you defined your dissertation. Now, for me, I thought that was a brilliant sentence. I thought it was a very good way of putting into a nutshell what you're doing, because as you said, a lot of it is oral history. Now, how did you then go about your research? Did you go and kind of actively seek out those people who were involved in those centers and those kind of organizations?
Well, actually, so yeah, it's an interesting story from my dissertation proposal to what it is now, because my dissertation proposal initially, I suppose it links back to my earlier question, the earlier question you asked me about like feminism in Pakistan and just perspective of what it means to be Pakistani and things like that, because my initial dissertation proposal was actually to see if there was any impacts or what were the implications of feminist movements in Pakistan and India upon those in Britain, and looking at if there were any kind of exchanges of knowledge across the diaspora. But it became more apparent that was really hard because a lot of stuff just isn't recorded, and there's little bits of like there's Kali Press in India and their work would be transported to like feminist festivals in the UK, and this was only something I found out based off an interview I did with an academic called Heidi Safia Mirza. She was kind of in the 1980s had written a leading book about Black feminism and the kind of second women's liberation movement and all that kind of stuff. And I got the opportunity to interview her, which was a great privilege, because I think that kind of changed the trajectory of how my dissertation was coming, because there wasn't really much clarity in how it was going. And I suppose that's also an issue that kind of still continues, is that the lack of recording of feminist history, especially in like Pakistan, is just something that I personally wasn't able to access. I think obviously because I'm not there, I can't use the archives there. A lot of stuff isn't digitized and online yet. So the reason the dissertation kind of became more UK focused was that I was able to find like little news clippings and little pictures here and there that kind of I was able to piece together. But it took a lot of work trying to connect it to like different journals and different articles. So it was quite a process getting it to the point it is now, with like focusing on 3 different chapters, because initially it was going to be much bigger than what it is. So it took a lot of time whittling it down to 3 different focuses.
No, definitely. Before we jump into those 3 different sections, I just wanted to kind of pick your brain about the oral history side of things. A lot of people would say oral history doesn't stand up within kind of the debate around historical sources, and there's always this argument about they're unreliable or they're not necessarily neutral and all the rest of it. Now, what would you say to people who would kind of put up that argument?
My first thing in mind is like history is never neutral, and that comes from position of privilege. And I write that in my dissertation because that's something that really frustrated me, because it came up in my first year as well, that oral history was an unreliable practice because it was from a people's perspective. History is all about people. It's all about people's interactions, people's emotions, everything about humanity as a whole. For you to disregard history, not you personally, but you to disregard like oral history as a practice, was just something that was really ridiculous to me, because I'm like, history is the culmination of our actions, past and present, and for our future. Oral history is a really important and descriptive way of kind of capturing that. So I always found it really ridiculous being like, well, I shouldn't use oral history because it's unreliable or it's not useful to analyze. But I'm really glad that my dissertation did kind of center oral history, because it is so important, especially in minority communities where our history hasn't been recorded. It isn't prioritized in history archives. It is largely what we have to rely on. So that was also, I think, a big factor in the dissertation from my perspective, for South Asian communities, oral history is something that we have been familiar with. Like you said, like immigrant stories, why our parents moved to the UK. And I think it gives a much more accurate image than kind of policy briefings or newspaper reports and things like that, because I think there's obviously very much a tendency to romanticize kind of people's moves to the UK and the immigrant story. And there's a tendency for, I think, young diaspora South Asians to speak over their parents' experiences rather. Instead, if you just interview them and you just let them speak and you let people do their thing, this way as a historical practice, it's much more intimate and it's so much more personal. And I think that's what makes it a reliable account. Like, I don't know, I feel like it's quite unfair when people treat oral history as a practice that has to be neutral, because I don't think necessarily that's a good way to actually record history at all.
No, completely agreed. I purposely had to just kind of ask you that question because I expected such an eloquent answer. So thank you for that. I think the sentence for me that really encapsulates the way you treat oral history, and to me, I absolutely love it, is the one that we used earlier, which was memorializing a living history that impacts generations to come. Because these works, like for argument's sake, your dissertation is literally memorializing what people prior to us have come and done. And yeah, like hats off to you for doing that. So diving into then those three sections that make up your dissertation, section 1 is titled Hostile Territories. Why did you decide to focus on the Sari Squad within this section? What makes them so important? And what was it that was creating such a hostile environment? I know that's quite a lot, but I feel like it all kind of relates to one another.
You know what it is? I think it's current present attitudes of the UK government towards migration. I think everyone currently refers to UK as a hostile territory for immigrants, particularly for illegal immigrants, quote unquote, because borders are so violent. And I think we've seen this through history. The enforcement of borders, particularly in Western countries, has never been for the benefit of minority communities. So when I wrote about the Sari Squad, I think it was kind of trying to record the backlash against this kind of fight just to live in a country, and the reactions of a state that had and continued to enforce very white racist ideals on the population. I think I was much more harsher initially in my draft and my dissertation, where I explicitly would call the UK racist and this and that and a white supremacist state. But obviously with history dissertations, you kind of have to substantiate that with more evidence. And obviously that was just my frustration coming out, which I think was absolutely justified when I was looking at it from a historical and present perspective. But I think, yeah, I phrased it a little bit better now in the dissertation, because the work of the Sari Squad, essentially, like a quick summary, was for the case of Afia Begum. It's been a while since I've written it now. But yeah, it was against her deportation And the way that they mobilized was really important, particularly because there was a few images of them outside a Tory rally that felt so present when I looked at it, because it was just like something that I think we can still identify with when you kind of look, especially recently with Priti Patel's increasing crackdown on illegal immigrants and deportation, everything that's happening with Kill the Bill protest. So I think that chapter especially was kind of bred out of that kind of frustration, but also looking at, well, what kind of work had previously been done, because currently there's like fantastic organizations like Sisters Uncut that have really led a lot of the fights against deportations. So I think in that chapter I was like, well, what kind of other organizations do we know that were quite radically opposed to the British state and the way that the British state has kind of manufactured really violent borders? And the Sari Squad felt like quite a good example to me, because I was able to find an interview that I referenced, I think, a few times. And I think there's like a footnote which includes a link to it. So I think if people want to listen and watch it, it's really good. And I think it summarizes it quite well, kind of British attitudes towards migrants.
Okay. Now, this was actually a question that I had saved for later on in our conversation, but you kind of touched upon it or alluded to it in your answer just now. And this is also just me playing devil's advocate. So to what extent would you agree that in fact these women, so for argument's sake, Sari Squad, were simply ensuring South Asian women and marginalized women were just becoming more acceptable to the population rather than safer? Particular perspective that would argue actually a lot of the initial kind of groundwork, so for argument's sake, the Sari Squad, that was in a sense making us more acceptable to the masses in terms of, well, we're not going anywhere, we're kind of here, you're going to really have to get used to us. And others would argue it's actually making a safer place for us. I don't know, like I think you could argue both. But personally, what like, how would you answer that? Like, which way would you suggest things would go?
I think when I wrote that section in the interview that I mentioned just before, the person who was working in the kind of legal behalf of the Sari Squad and Begum put it quite well in essentially saying the British government shouldn't get to decide whose families get a right of citizenship and the right to live. And I think the Sari Squad is a good example of not chasing after this idea of being seen as a valid British citizen, but just seen as deserving of a basic human right. But I guess that kind of brings, I think your question kind of brings in this idea of like assimilation or integration, because I think this is kind of idea as a South Asian person, if you move to the UK, you have to assimilate because like you've moved to the country now, you're part of us now, you have to be British.
Well, I don't know if I necessarily mean assimilate, because like for argument's sake, when I think about my own family, my grandma came over here in the 70s. Yeah, she got a job in factories and worked her ass off to make ends meet and look after my dad and his brothers, and she's still to this day doesn't, like, she knows broken English, but she doesn't really know English. So in terms of assimilation in that question, I don't necessarily mean assimilate, because I think, especially with the Sikh community, like my physical identity, I can't hide that. I can't integrate in that sense, if you get what I mean. But I think what I'm trying to allude to is, do you think that the period of history that you studied was actually a period where the people involved were making Britain safer, or simply making us, and I say that kind of colloquially as in it just includes everyone that's not British or white, or was it just making a safer place for us rather than it being just more acceptable? Because for argument's sake, I know you don't hear of violent racism as much as, like, for argument's sake, our parents would have had to deal with, but that still exists. Like, we only have to look at like the Euros and how that reaction took place to Saka and Rashford and Sancho to see how those systems are still, although they're probably more subtle, they're still there. So I don't know necessarily whether I mean integration or assimilation. I guess that does come into it, but and in a way, actually, I don't think I am talking about that, because for argument's sake, the Sari Squad, I saw the image in your dissertation of the woman attached to the bars, and the thing to me that really stood out was the fact that her visual dress was distinctive, as in she hadn't assimilated into Western clothing. So to a large extent, the people involved in these centers didn't assimilate or integrate in their practice, or their praxis, so to speak. And so were they actually making it safer by creating these spaces, or were those spaces helping to just make the image of us more acceptable?
Okay, yeah, I think I mistook your questions a bit. My bad.
No, not a problem. This is the beauty of having these conversations.
Yeah. No, I think you bring a really interesting point there, because I think I talk a little bit about the visual aspects of like the Sari Squad wearing traditional clothing, particularly because there's a police encounter where one of the women is literally forced, like, stripped down to just her petticoats and a blouse, and she was like, this is the first time I'd been arrested. It was really humiliating. For me, like, as an Asian woman, this has never happened to me before. This is the first time it's happened. And it's hard because I think these women fighting for sites of safety, that safety has always been really precarious, I think, for South Asian women in particular, just being on the margins of being a woman, being visibly, obviously, like, South Asian. So yeah, it's kind of hard to answer, because I'm like, well, these women fought really hard to put forward their visual identity as South Asian women, like by wearing saris to their protests, by explicitly calling themselves the Sari Squad. But that kind of safety was never really something that was offered to them, and they were kind of always on the kind of line of, well, we're really vulnerable to kind of racist protesters, or to the police as well, police brutality, which I think obviously something that still pertains today.
So, okay, but I guess then would you summarize it by saying that they fought for a safer space that allowed for future generations to be more acceptable or more accepted within society?
I suppose they did, yeah.
Like, to an extent, because obviously the immigration laws, as you're saying, like, there are so many parallels we can draw between now and then. But in terms of kind of racism, the misogyny, the homophobia, I know to some extent a lot of that still persists. Like, I'm not denying the reality of things, but in relation to your dissertation, would you just kind of summarize that bit by saying actually they did they put in the groundwork, like they actually were the frontline soldiers who kind of did the slog, went and protested, mobilized, had these centers, etc., which then created a space that they had obviously fought for that was quite safe, but then it's a space within which future generations are more accepted or acceptable, or however you kind of want to term that.
I think, yes, especially I think in relation to kind of South Asian women's citizenship and our right to actually raise their families. And there was a lot of like consideration of kind of, women's right to live as like mothers and wives and just as citizens, because I think women, especially at that time, your relationship, even within immigration law, was always to a figure. It was, so I think for future generations, yes, I think they wanted to establish a groundwork that would impact future generations, but also I don't know if they imagined that we'd be in the same kind of position with immigration and that fight for immigration rights. Because I think the important thing is also within the wider context, like you can see how a lot of the Black radical movements and Black feminist movements with like OAD were really impacting that kind of fight for immigration. So it was very much a collective battle, and also I think a lot of organizations took influence from those movements already. So that kind of fight for immigration for Black and brown citizens was just something that was still really consistent then, and I think obviously that fight was for future generations and to consistently battle for their right to citizenship. But also I don't know if they imagined that we'd still be in this position. in 2021.
Fair. Yeah, no, fair. No, I can't disagree with any of that. This is just a random question that so like obviously doing this podcast, I watch a lot of other podcasts to try and like sharpen my skills and like figure out how to ask questions better and react to answers, etc. And so last night I was watching JME's interview with ZZ Mills, and I only started watching it because I'd seen a clip of it where he had mentioned that he wears a do-rag, or he started wearing a do-rag because of a Sikh guy who he went to school with. And I was like, that sounds hilarious. So I started watching more of it. And towards the end, he asked ZZ Mills, what do you think of the fact of the term black in terms of referring to all black people? So for argument's sake, he was like, doesn't it make sense for it to be referred more by kind of the country they come from? Now, similarly, like we're talking about a huge group of women here. And I know the term South Asian gets bandied about a lot, but do you think that term really gives justice to all of the multiplicity of identities within that huge group? Because even like for me, one thing that I also found quite interesting is Europe and Asia are on the same piece of land, so to speak. But throughout history, throughout your education, you're kind of made to view Europe as this completely separate place from Asia. Like Asia is this completely kind of alien, exotic, oriental, I don't know, yoga, chai tea, opium type place. Yeah, like I know it sounds really stupid. I'm just trying to like trivialize it in terms of getting the question. But like, do you think the term South Asian really? And I'm not taking like, this isn't a dig at you or anything, like as in I'm just talking about the kind of the term as a term within academia. Do you think it really does justice to all of those different people involved?
I think that's the thing with collective terms though, like I don't know if it was necessarily do. I think they just make it easier for us to categorize and refer to it. Like I don't know what the right term would be. Like, for example, like with BAME, it's like Black, Asian, minority, ethnic. And a lot of that is just to do with like you being non-white. Same with like people of color. Like there's also the issue of racism within the Asian community and with larger minority ethnic communities towards Black communities. So some people are saying Black and people of color. So I think that's the thing with collective terms. It's really difficult because I think for me, like I usually just go with like, yeah, I'm brown. And that works for me as an umbrella term. Like, yeah, I'm brown. I'm like Pakistani. It just feels a bit more comfortable. Like, I think it's not always something that I've exactly looked into for myself, because for me, it just feels
that's a good point.
Like a comfortable term. That's the thing, right? Like, yeah. I think, especially in academia though, because there's an interesting point, because I've applied for a master's in modern South Asian studies, but for the courses I've applied to, modern South Asian studies, the focus is not on like Sri Lanka or Nepal, even Bangladesh very much. It's on India and Pakistan, and it's largely on wealthy parts of India and Pakistan. That's the thing. So when academia comes through, they use these kind of umbrella terms to be like, oh, look, we're doing like diverse and representational history, but you're still only doing that for select countries.
I think the important bit that you picked up on is actually that I've never, ever heard anyone in their life refer to themselves as South Asian, ever. And so I just find it fascinating, because the variety of identities that just one person can have, that gets completely kind of squashed by these academic terms. It's just interesting then to see what others thought. And also, I saw you had kind of alluded to it slightly in your dissertation, so I thought it was worthwhile putting that question to you.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. I think that's the thing with like academic jargon versus this translation to day-to-day life is always going to be it's always going to be slightly different, right? And I suppose that's the point of academia. Like, it's meant to kind of offer summaries and reports and findings of kind of issues that people experience day-to-day life. That doesn't necessarily mean they're accessible to the people that it impacts in the way of like making it easy and defining terms. Like, I think it's absolutely fine. Academic jargon is really important for writing those words. But I think it's also important to know those kind of definitions yourself. I think even me myself, like, there's a lot of stuff that I just hadn't like praxis. Like, it's just the practice of academic work through practical means. That's something I don't really know about until my final year and in my dissertation and things like that. I also didn't use that word in my dissertation, so I was like, I'm going to use it wrong and it's unfamiliar. It's the same thing with using, like, I think academic terms, like even with like using South Asian, like I used it, but that was also largely in reference to like Indian, Pakistani and Bangladeshi women. It wasn't like Nepalese women who also some people define themselves as being Desi. That's the thing.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that's a good point, which is actually even within those terms, they're not necessarily living up to what you think they mean. So I think that's a good point with your masters, which is the South Asian bracket. Although we might think it applies to a huge area, in a lot of cases it's very select. So no, I appreciate the answers to that. Just a quick question that I thought was fascinating. Not surprising though, because all of the stories I hear from my dad and his brothers about when they first came to the country were basically learning, like Bruce Lee was all the craze. So they learned how to use nunchucks and learned Kung Fu and all the rest of it. Keeping on to that kind of martial arts topic, you mentioned that the Sari Squad are trained in numerous mixed martial arts, which I thought was just brilliant. Again, not surprising though. In the research you did and the work that you obviously had to put together before the dissertation, were there any anecdotes or instances where the Sari Squad had to put their martial arts into practice? Like, did anyone come to blows with someone?
I'm going to be honest, no, and this is where issues of historical archiving come in, because I found this in a Guardian article somewhere. Like, it was literally 3 lines in reference to, the Sari Squad learned self-defense, but it was in a sentence with, but they also would sing at rallies with racist protesters to drown them out. So it's really interesting that this kind of element of self-defense was something that was really important, but we don't really get to see in practice at all. But I think it's quite important, like you mentioned earlier, like with your family, like in my area, obviously skinheads are like a massive thing. My dad apparently, also very random fact, which he randomly popped out with years later, as Asian dads do, was like, I had a black belt in like karate, but my grandma was afraid, my daddy was afraid that my dad would use it one day, so she made him stop, which at that time in Britain seemed like a likely option because of how violent the racism was and how big skinheads were, especially in like East London as well.
No, definitely. And that's why it resonated with me, because obviously similar kind of experiences within my family. And I wonder if there's like, you've come across anyone who's been like, I saw so-and-so deck the police officer because he tried to arrest her. Like, I don't know, like that's just a random example. I don't know if that actually happened. But no, fair enough. Okay, moving then on to section 2, you focus on 2 community centres in particular. One is the Jagonari Centre and the other is Bradford Women's Centre. Now, why did you decide to pick those 2 places and what makes them so important?
So the Jagonari Centre, I think I picked for because the particular quote from an academic, it was an example of an architectural essay in terms of the visual qualities of that building is very telling of the work of the Sari Squad, not the Sari Squad, my bad, of the Jagonari Centre and their work and their aims. And the Bradford Women's Centre, I think, there's very limited material on them, but I think that was purposely the reason I chose them, because I was able to bring in more about the Bradford AYM, which is the Bradford Asian Youth Movement, and the kind of implications that had on limiting South Asian women's mobilisation in the area, and how instead of being explicitly political, those groups were rather for kind of women's healthcare or women's kind of standards of living and just women's access to things with like childcare and kind of legal services. So I think this chapter was a little bit less about their political campaigning, but more about what kind of practical setups were established for women who just moved to the UK for like the first generation of immigrants.
No, thank you for that. I think that's a brilliant summary of those 2 places. And the question that I actually had prepared, you've already answered. So thanks for you having such a overall answer. Really, that it helps me. Okay, so section 3 then is something that I found absolutely fascinating, because I've never had the chance to explore kind of into that side of history. And equally, I think something that you allude to quite a lot within your dissertation, which is marginalized people's history is rarely recorded. So yeah, section 3, transgressive sexualities. What does this cover? You mainly discuss Club Carly, which after I read that chapter, I went and found it on Twitter. I followed it. I think it was it DJ Ritu? I might have that wrong. Yeah, I went and found her, followed her, because I just found it absolutely fascinating how kind of one person creating one little place back then had such a fascinating impact on just how things progressed. So without me kind of saying too much else, what gave rise to Club Carly? What were reactions to Club Carly at the time? And why was it so important?
So Club Carly is really interesting because it's still really active now, obviously because of COVID, not as much. But I think I was first introduced to them when I think I went to Pride in London. I went to the Pride in London rally a few years ago. And people were talking about going to like a Club Carly event, something like that. So it'd been in like the back of my mind that it was one of those organisations that I'd like to look into more. And it started off with like co-founding by Rita H and DJ Ritu. And this chapter is really important in terms of the oral history because it was largely just formed based on these little interviews and podcasts that like they'd both done. Like one YouTube interview that was like 4 minutes with Rita H, 2 different podcasts. One was like called Queer Recollections, and that was with DJ Ritu, which informed the bulk of the chapter actually. And another one with BBC Sounds, I think. And then the sources that I use was found because I did some work with the Museum of Youth Culture, and someone else who worked there had interviewed DJ Ritu. So I got into contact with her, and she'd got the private collections of some of the posters, and she forwarded them to me. So yeah, if anyone does want to like know more about DJ Ritu's work as well, like Mira McCarty on Museum of Youth Culture talks about it. That was kind of the background of it. And the reason to talk about Club Carly, especially because there isn't really much of a queer South Asian history in Britain at all, even though there has been a presence of queer South Asians in Britain. And they use queer as a umbrella term, but also like LGBTQ plus as well. It's another one that I use. I try to use both to kind of be inclusive and use interchangeable terms based on what people are comfortable with. And the chapter is really interesting in looking at kind of the recollections of the early nights of like Club Carly, and how the wider nightclub scene. People would just use Asia as an umbrella term for like world music. And DJ Ritu was seen as kind of specialist in it because she was one of the leading like South Asian women who was kind of putting forward that front, and kind of one of the really popular DJs at that time with that type of music. And she initially worked for Shakti, which was another South Asian LGBTQ organisation. And I think she started holding those kind of DJ nights to raise money for the organisation. And that eventually led to the establishment of Club Carly, which would kind of host really fun Bhangra nights and really fun Bollywood nights. And the whole aspect of it was to give people a reminder of home when they couldn't go back to their homes. For South Asian queer youth who were kicked out of their homes, who couldn't be honest about who they were. And this chapter, I think, looks a little bit more at kind of internal conflicts within the South Asian community in Britain and the kind of rampant homophobia that came not only from the wider impact of Section 28 and the Tory government and people's perceptions of homosexuality in the public realm, but also within the kind of private spheres of South Asian families as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. To be honest, when I was reading through that chapter, a lot of the experiences that were jumping out, I have friends or people that I know of who have shared similar stories. So for me, what was quite interesting overall, not just with the third chapter, with quite a lot of it actually, was just how relevant it feels. Although you're kind of studying from the 1970s onwards, I just felt you could remove the time period you're studying and give it to someone else to read, and they'd be like, oh, what did this happen like 5 years ago, for argument's sake? Now, from your introduction, there were a couple of quotes that really, really stuck with me. The first was political blackness as a collective identifier had a certain way of silencing the very specific experiences of Asian people. And the second was they homogenized the representation of South Asians within the parameters of heteronormativity. Now, why do you think South Asian people, in particular South Asian women, and even more so queer South Asians, have been largely ignored from historiography? Why do you think this has occurred? Is it largely down to the value that people are perceived to provide to the British state, or is it Orientalist ideologies, or is it even a combination of both?
I think a lot of it is, it's a little bit of both. I think also historical practice has a way of kind of homogenizing people's experiences. And I think political blackness as a term as well has still been kind of used for like activist historians and things like that, which is it's a really important term for that, especially looking back at the kind of fundamental impact that Black liberation movements had on South Asian communities in Britain. But when it comes to continuing to use political blackness, when it comes to like historical practice, the quote that you talked about was by Stuart Hall. And I think particularly for Black and brown women, those experiences were collectivized. It doesn't give justice to the specific experiences of Black communities in Britain either. Like, it does erase Black women's experiences in Britain. It erases the kind of issues of racism and anti-Blackness in South Asian communities. It takes away from kind of ways that we can actually see specific nuances in history, particularly because a lot of history is written by white people. Like, let's be honest, like so much of this history is written by like white feminists. So like obviously a lot of the historiography was constantly, like I talked about this in my interview with Heidi Mirza, like so much of this period's feminist history was written by like white feminists who were constantly like, yeah, we feel bad, like Black and brown women were excluded, but they'd use like collective terms and they'd constantly center like white women still within that narrative, versus instead, if you provide the kind of space for Black and Asian women to actually give forward their stories of the fact that yes, the second wave kind of feminist movement in Britain at this time didn't really give a lot of women the kind of space to kind of fight their fight for kind of racism and kind of homophobia. It was always really difficult, even within kind of these organizations where women's, from different ethnic backgrounds, their experiences were just kind of smushed together. Well, no, not so, probably not the best academic way to put it, but that's kind of how it felt.
No. I can completely understand what you mean. And don't worry, like this is an academic conversation, so you're allowed to use terms such as smushed together, because I think that it does describe what we're discussing, which is actually, and I think we've alluded to it as well previously in the podcast with the conversation about kind of the term South Asian, which is like the way people identify is so complex and interesting and varied that in order to just smush it all together, it doesn't really make sense. So even for myself, like my nationality on my passport is British, but I don't like, I have like, I know it's home. This is where I've grown up and I love it because of that. But if you were to ask me, I'd say I'm a no nation state of mind person. Like, I'm not attached to any nation. Like, as I discussed with Satnam Singera on the previous podcast about Empire Land and the British Empire, is like, we're here because you were there. Like, yeah. And when I discuss it with my family, I'm often like, or with my brothers, I'm like, well, we're just coming back to get what they took from our ancestors. And I know that kind of trivializes things a little bit. Like, just from that example, those identities can be so complex. So I don't know, even in like when I'm filling out forms and it's like, how do you identify? And it's like British, British Asian, white, this, whatever. And I'm like, well, none of them really include me. Some of them do, some don't. And I think that's just the thing, which is like, to really do history justice, you have to be very honest to the people that you're studying. And I think one thing that really resonated with me reading your dissertation, and I think it's very clear from the conversation we've had so far, is that you really care about the people you're studying. And so hence why I've kind of pricked your brain with some of these questions about identifiers, because like your answers have been extremely illuminating, and I found them really interesting. So thank you for that. One question then that I have to ask off the back of doing all of the research that you've done is, what was the most important understanding or lesson or kind of story that you took from the work you did for your dissertation? Like, what is the one thing you would say, you know what, this stuck out to me and I'll never forget it and it's taught me something?
I think the last section especially was really moving and really difficult for me to write, because so much of it was such intimate history in a way that I think other like history undergrads as well will probably attest to this. Like, you don't really study history in that way at all. So I was saying a trigger warning because in those kind of interviews with DJ Ritu, like they mention how in the club people were palming, and a lot of people were quite personal livelihood was not an importance because there was no decent standard of living for people from marginalized communities whose identities were constantly like at risk of being compromised by their own community and by the wider like British state as well. So this last chapter was, I think, quite difficult to kind of write in mind of personal histories are difficult to write about, and you can't like romanticize them. You can't kind of glaze over constantly like the real difficulties and darkness that comes with being a minority, especially in Britain. And I never went into it thinking it would be particularly positive either, but I think because I've not focused as much on people's intimate kind of oral truth and things like that, it was quite difficult being like, well, I don't want to sensationalize people's experiences. I don't want to romanticize people's experiences. I just want to write about what I know and what I can see, and I'll just do my best, because I know I call the dissertation like storytelling through protest, but like there was definite shortcomings in the dissertation where I didn't like phrase it well enough. I didn't make it as clear as I should have made it more accessible, like avoiding certain terminology, things like that. So I think it was a really good experience in kind of learning how exactly when you are writing histories about communities, how you can make it do justice to those communities, and how you can actually just give a fair, like, not representation, because it's not representation of entirety of people's experiences, but just give like somewhat of a decent enough account of what you know.
No, definitely. And I think your dissertation does that quite well in terms of you are very honest in terms of the shortcomings of academia, some of the issues to do with kind of sources, oral history in particular. You're very aware of representing people honestly rather than kind of talking over them, or as you've created a perfect academic term, smushed them together with others. So I can honestly say hats off to you, and you should be like tremendously proud of your dissertation because it was a pleasure to read it. Before we wrap up though, I just wanted to check, is there anything that you wanted to ask or anything you wanted to discuss, or is there anything that I've missed out that you just want to include?
I would say in reference actually to the last question as well, especially like university spaces are not going to be the best kind of space to really discuss marginalized communities experiences. Like an academic setting will always come from a place of privilege, and all in particular within this kind of lens of whiteness and Eurocentrism. And obviously with the kind of current change of the government cracking down on like arts departments and even cutting down on like history courses, because there's that big fear of like decolonizing the curriculum. A lot of these universities, unless they will actually change in the foundational structure and their learning, like decolonizing will just be a buzzword, and it will continue to be a buzzword because these are institutions that are built off colonial ideas. So they add, like, as much as like my dissertation was like a privileged experience to write and things like that, I still don't think it will be like the most accurate representation or the best learning base for, I think, minority communities to kind of really learn about their history. I think that comes from actually meeting people face to face, doing grassroots work and doing like campaigning, things like that.
No, fair enough. I don't particularly disagree with that. I think, and again, this is something that comes up quite often actually in different conversations with people, is how academia in one way is viewed as beneficial, but in a lot of senses it has huge shortcomings. I think the interesting kind of part of this is that Britain seems to be kind of going through some type of like a reckoning or awakening or whatever you want to call it, in terms of like this conversation around decolonizing the curriculum, etc. I think, well, I don't think this. Satnam Sanghera on the last podcast was very kind of bullish about the fact that there's kind of a motion in action that is just not going to stop. So this kind of like decolonization of the curriculum, no matter how much they try to oppose it, it's eventually going to happen. And I find it kind of interesting because when I did my history degree, like in our second year, we had a load of topics that were about the British Empire. And I remember doing a paper that basically talked about how fucking bollocks it was, and how and again, I had that kind of raw emotion kind of in my undergraduate history degree. Like you were saying, you started off your introduction with kind of this white supremacist state, like very similar kind of things. And then obviously you have to start substantiating things, and you kind of come to realize things are a lot more nuanced. So no, I appreciate that. I really find that interesting. I think one thing that I found most eye-opening to me, and something that I'm definitely going to dive into more, is how you're honest about the shortcomings of academia, although you're still trying to then do the people you've discussed their justice, or be as honest as you can for them. So I admire that tremendously. Equally, I have to obviously say thank you once again for taking the time out to do this, and for sending me your dissertation, because it was absolutely brilliant read. And I think a lot could be learned from it. So I don't know if you have any plans of publishing it or anything like that, but I just think it's something everyone should read. If you don't mind, I'd love to conclude with the following quote from your dissertation, which I think would be a perfect way of wrapping things up, which is: "The racism, misogyny, and homophobia faced by South Asian women are not just memories, but a stark reality."